Olá, muito bem-vindos novamente ao canal do Nexus, Nexus TV. A gente vai trazer conteúdo aqui sobre não só psicoterapia, mas conteúdos adjacentes à psicoterapia, coisas sobre mudanças, princípios e processos de mudanças nos seres humanos, também assuntos sobre psicologia, ciência, pesquisa e tudo mais que está ao redor, né, da psicoterapia, do trabalho que a gente faz dentro da sala de terapia. Então, conteúdo diverso que a gente vai trazer aqui para vocês. E eu tô hoje com uma pessoa que é muito especial, é um amigo e um pensador e um coach de primeira mão, assim, faz um trabalho excelente em processos de mudança humana. Eu gosto de pensar no trabalho do Rob Scott, que está aqui comigo, como um trabalho que é bem equivalente, ou melhor, compatível com um trabalho de terapia cognitiva, de TCC, mas que é repaginado com uma base mais filosófica e bem profunda. Ele fala muito sobre mudança de identidade, mudança fundamental de identidade, que é parte do que a gente vai conversar aqui hoje. Ele se apresentou na conferência da Consciência, que o Nexus fez parte, e eu vou colocar aqui na descrição o link para quem quiser assistir a participação dele, assim como outras fontes para vocês conhecerem um pouco mais do trabalho dele. Eu vou trocar para o inglês agora para bater um papo. Switching to English now, so that you can understand.
Yeah.
Thank you again for agreeing to do this, to have a conversation here with me for folks in Brazil.
I'm very excited to do it. Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, I just, 2 days ago, I rewatched your presentation at the Consilience conference where you give a brief overview. I know at the conference you have like 20 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Go over so much.
Yeah.
You did a great job of combining some of your main ideas about, the self and shifting. I guess you didn't talk much about lenses there, but you talked some about shifting, I guess, identity and your portal of identity. Anyway, we can get into all that.
Yeah, please.
Before we do, it would be cool to get a little bit of a summary. I don't know if that's something you do, but if you can give me or give people actually a snapshot of what you do, of the core of your line of thinking, of your ideas, to introduce it to folks in Brazil who may not be familiar with it.
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Rob Scott. I own a business called Fundamental Shift, and I do the actual coaching is really called identity shifting. And maybe that'd be interesting at some point later to go deeper into what the shift might be and then what the shifting might be, right? Like, what does that look like? The ultimate goal of that might be something like something else that I talk about a lot, which is stillness in motion. And to make that make sense to people, that would be what I would call like the highest level of self-mastery. And so all of those things are really interesting. A little bit about my personal story. I grew up in a very dysfunctional situation, ended up with all kinds of bad patterns and addictions and really horrible and self-harming psychologies that I was just carrying around. And I really woke up in an instant in a really profound way to see that I didn't have to be as attached to the story of my life and the quote unquote truth of it, that it was way more interpretations than it had to be factual. Meaning my abuse and all these things had ended long before, and yet I was the one that was carrying the story of them into the moment and almost projecting them onto everything I was doing. So I continued to live into, an oversimplified description of it is a victim identity, or, everything is hard, everything is wrong. And that becomes very easily a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You keep proclaiming that, you keep exclaiming that to people. That's what you are, and this is what the world is, and this is going on. And through that fundamental shift, which was a profound wake up, I was like, well, what if I put all that down and didn't even try to optimize it? It wasn't positive thinking. It wasn't anything like that. I was just like, what if I didn't believe in those stories? Like, what could I do from here right now? And, to just go through it really quickly, I went from homeless in and out of institutions and jails and all kinds of like really dysfunctional things to vice president of technology within a handful of years. And I didn't have any education to do that, right? It was like all kind of self-created and self-motivated. And I became highly functional myself. And then part of that rise in the corporate world was that I was able to get great results out of other people as well. So being able to apply some of these things to people that worked with me and for me was very effective. And just as another side note, in the middle of that pretty short corporate run, I got really sick with cancer. and, people thought I might die and all this stuff. And so my mother would tell you that there was no fear of death during that. I mean, I can tell you that also, but there were people around me that could just tell that there was like a deep peace within me with whatever was going on, but also able to show up and kind of do whatever needed to be done to handle that. So, I ended up as somebody who had gone through all of the physical abuse, emotional dysfunction, mental dysfunction, etc., and really figured something out. And so it was like 2004 or 5, I started a podcast where I just wanted to share some of these ideas, and people all over the world started asking me for coaching. And I didn't even really understand what that meant. They're like, what does it cost to work with you? Like, how do we do this and that? And eventually I sort of figured out, I really love that. And I left the corporate world in, I think, 2006 to start this business, and just called it The Fundamental Shift, and have been building out this model of what is the fundamental shift? What is identity shifting? How do we embody stillness and motion in a meaningful way? And what does that look like? And so I don't think you exactly asked for my story. I mean, the overarching concept here that's very different than traditional therapy and other things is right at the beginning in The Fundamental Shift. I'm suggesting that we are actually not selves. We are a kind of consciousness that's capable of having selves. And that there's this profound shift in backing up our sense of awareness to see that solving process happen. And that not only gives us a freedom that's profound all by itself, but it also gives us a perspective where we can actually edit the parts of the self very meaningfully in our own psychology. And that is the fundamental shift. And then the act of doing that in all the different ways would be the process of identity shifting that I work on with people.
Wow, there's so much in there.
Sorry.
No, that's great. I've listened to your story before, other times when I listen to you talk, but every time it's like, wow, that's incredibly powerful, because this moment of awakening, you talk about it and I hear as if it was, a single moment. I'm curious to know, how did that unfold? Because it sounds like that's been the foundation of the work that you do with folks, right? Obviously,
Yes.
probably developed after the fact, after you experienced it. But that is super interesting, because, and now I'm going to derail a little bit, because
Sure.
That's activating some thoughts. Most people get into, helping careers, or, they become a therapist through learning the theory, and getting academic about, or learning about all the techniques and all of that. And not always through this personal process of figuring something out about life, having the insight, and developing that so that you can use it in an applied way. So that's a different trajectory that obviously has been super successful. And I've known your work through Greg enough to know that it is deeply meaningful and profound.
Yeah.
More profound than, the golden standard for therapy nowadays, in my opinion, my humble opinion. So can you tell me a little bit more about that, this awakening process, and how that developed into something that you can actually use?
Yeah. So I love that question. It's a very good question. I'm not positive I have a very good answer for it, because there's a lot of parts to it that I'd love to talk about. One is the permanence of it. I think a lot of people could, have a spiritual experience that's a real wake up, and then somehow that collapses back on itself and it becomes a memory, or becomes something they try to have again, as if it was this great state experience and they want to do it. In my case, it was actually a real profound escaping from time in a meaningful way into a very persistent now, if you will. And it was a deep understanding of how we psychologically use time and almost get trapped in time. So there was that element of it. The other one was that was a very profound, like, in the moment understanding, was how the self feels so separate, and how maybe that's not true, right? It's not true. We're actually a part of this oneness that's really profound. And so there was this illusion that just got dissolved for me that wasn't highly functional right away, right? I didn't have the tools to know much of what to do with that. So, I would scream truth to power and still looked like this young guy who just didn't know what he was talking about, et cetera. And I didn't have the credentials or the backup to prove it or show it. But I knew it, right? It was more true to me than anything I'd ever seen before. And so it's really an escape of the human condition in a sense, right? So if we think about the human condition oversimplified as a problem with our psychological self in relationship with consciousness, and how that psychological self is driven to stay safe, to not die, to, be perceived a certain way, like all of that stuff, the loneliness, the what am I supposed to do next, all of that, to have an escape from that into a perspective of just simple observer without any oughts, right? It's an escape out of all of the oughts of humanness of it. This ought to happen and that ought to happen. And I have this belief and that assumption into just a real connection with isness directly, where there wasn't a me and an it, there was just the isness. And so that never left me, right? It doesn't mean that I can't fully be Rob and be a self also, but the self moved in front of that awareness in some sense for me. And so it's been, decades now of putting that into language, making that useful to a self that hasn't had that experience. And how can we show you that experience? It doesn't need to be as profound, but is that useful to get a different sense of some of the pathologies of our psychological selves, some of the traumas that we can't get past, or the people we can't forgive, or what is intimacy? What is codependency? Like all of the self problems after that.
All of our attachments, right?
Yeah, all of our attachments totally start to relate to that, right? So that's absolutely foundational. And then why I talk about identity shifting differently is it's different to talk about how are you in relationship, or how are you a leader, or how do you have the courage to speak on stage? Those kinds of things that are the individual problems that people would like to get past. Those all have different categories and different strategies. I mean, you're so familiar with Utah. That doesn't have one thing, it's got 20 things, there's a lot to it, because it's like, what perspective are we looking from? But at the heart of it is this difference in what does it mean to be like the self that I think I am is not permanent. It's not the same as you were when you were 5. It's not going to persist after you die, but some level of like what I'm connected to is permanent, is present, isn't relating in time the same way. What is that? And if I can leave self in a meaningful way, which sounds difficult and mystical and weird, we're doing it all the time. We just don't see the profundity of it. And so I don't mean to oversimplify it either, but like if you're truly tasting a strawberry, that act is actually awake. Like there's nothing else going on. You're just in the experience of a strawberry. Most of us taste that, judge it really quick from a self perspective, like it, say, I've got to buy more of these strawberries, and do the whole planning and self in the world begins on top of that. And so the realization that that's a psychological process, not a fact, and that psychological process can show up in a myriad of different ways, gives us a ton of freedom to change how that shows up, or even put it down to just be in experience more beautifully. And just another way to point to that is people talk about flow states and athletes being just totally in the moment, and time feels very different. And they're excellent in that moment, right? They're just so engaged with the reaction and what's happening. It all feels like automatic. It's much more like that than it is the anxious self that's like, well, how do I catch it? And where do I need to be? And what's everybody going to think of me? And all those anxieties that come on top of the self that's trying to win at everything or survive everything or that, right? So
yeah, I was hoping that you would bring up the concept of isness. I know that it's at the foundation of all. I love it. And I've heard you talk about it in the past as this really attainable thing. Like it may seem super elusive, like, how the fuck do I get to isness? I'm always in my own body. I'm always in my own self.
Yes.
I'm always attached to my roles and identities. At the same time, I've heard you talk about it that way, and maybe you can describe it better than me. But you can, like, I don't know, close your eyes and open your eyes and very easily just realize that all of those things exist at this level of abstraction that is not necessarily in the here and now. It's not really attached to time. So can you explain that better than I can?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best. One of the first things I try to do with people is say, at the core, you have attention, right? There is a consciousness that's happening. Like that's, I might be over here talking to you, et cetera, but like what's pre all of that is like, I'm attending to something, right? That my attention is now being pulled. And also I might even try to keep it there, like on this conversation with you to some degree. But loud bang were to happen, we might automatically like look at the loud bang. There's an attentional, quality to life that is the very first thing, right? And that's prior to even judging something as good or bad. Like something happens and then we have to judge it good or bad, et cetera. And those judgments of good or bad are part of the self. But what's underneath the self is just an awareness, just an observer. I'll get weird for 1 second. Physics is having a lot of difficulty with some of the observer problems. What does it mean to have an observation change an experiment? And what is the observer? And are these, LTs, the language transformers, the GPTs and stuff, do they have a perspective? Like what's happening with this, right? So there's all these things. You have a perspective, right? There is an awakeness in you that's primary. Without any of the extra, whatever the extra can be, that is the base of isness. That's what's going on. And the first useful thing is to realize that your attention has a place, okay? So if anybody wants to play along at home, your attention might be on this conversation now, but I could invite you to say, okay, what does your left foot feel like? And if you did that sincerely, you would go in your attention and literally at a place, you would move it to your left foot. And then I would say, okay, what does your right foot feel like? And you would maybe check, like, I can feel pressure in mine and all this stuff. Then I would say, what's your left hand feel like, right? And that has a different thing. But I'm capable somehow to like have agency to move this attention around. And then also it might be moved for me by a loud bang or those kinds of things as well. But we also could say, okay, let's imagine when you were 3 years old, right? And if you did that sincerely, like we could close our eyes and go, okay, when I was 3, when I was 4, when I was 5, what are your memories? Is it riding a bike? Is it being with your family at a thing? Your attention has moved to a different place that we might call the past in that regard, right? If I said, okay, let's plan the next 5 years, and you did that, earnestly, the attention would be in a different place. It would be in some imagined future and et cetera, right? And so I always like to add this last one. It's like, well, let's imagine something that isn't real, like a purple elephant dancing on a trampoline or something. We could close our eyes and imagine that purple elephant. That's another place, right? It's in my imagination. It's not related to time. It's just this kind of weird thing that we're doing. So what am I doing there? I'm showing that your attention is movable around. It's in all of these places. I didn't do a lot with this, but it also has a wideness and a focus, right? We could open your perception to not just your foot, but more of your whole body. Maybe what are you hearing and seeing? Like, there's these practices, right? So attention has all this quality. It's really helpful to realize that there are two main domains of that attention, okay? One is in thought and one is in sensation. It's really important. And that's a really long build up to maybe get to something that's like, well, who cares, right? But what I want to point out is that even if we're imagining the past, we didn't go to the past. That's not a real place in time. That's an imagination about the past. If I go to the future and planning, that's an imagination about the future. The bouncing elephant is an imagination, etc. But the sensation in my foot is a sensation, right? That's not a thought. And we could get into, you're very quickly thinking about it. You might go, I like that feeling or I don't like it. That's adding thought onto experience, etc., right? Most people are lost in thought. They can't stop the attachments of, whether it's shame and guilt about the past or anxiety and fear about the future. They are in thought all the time. And if you invite them to go, hey, what does your breath feel like even for 10 breaths? They're not capable of keeping it there. So that being lost in thought is we're lost in a model that we're not really that agentic over. And we're getting moved around by media messages or all of the things, and we're being pulled, and it's chaotic. It's uncontrollable. It's exhausting. There's a home base of your attention, which is back into sensation, where you start to realize, oh, that's where I really feel the beautiful things. Oh, that's where I really feel like how good a taste is or whatever. And you notice that when I'm tasting the strawberry and it's delicious, as soon as I begin planning to get more of the strawberries, I lose the taste, right? My attention has moved into thought again. At a very base level, if we don't have any agency over moving our attention out of thought and into sensation, we probably also don't have much agency in moving from a negative thought to maybe a more positive thought kind of thing, right? So how can I be constructive with my thinking? So we go from almost trapped in thought, which often relates very much to time, because time is a structure of psychological thought. It's like, what happened to me? What do I want to happen to me? And so that's being modeled by us all the time. We end up on this treadmill of time where I'm never there yet, right? It's constant planning and fixing and winning to get to some fake end result that's not a real place or a real thing. And so where we actually want to get, which is, people might not believe me, but I promise this is the real answer. You want to be here, fully arrived and satisfied, and then using thought in a way that's fun and productive and beautiful as a self that's under your control. So we go from being out of control in thought to potentially free of thought, and then we can start to use thought as the tool that it can be for us instead of being trapped in it, right? And so then it goes much deeper into a lot of your thoughts are from different traumatic things that have happened to you and fears and rules that those have set up. And that's where we get into lenses and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, but we'll get into lenses.
That foundational difference between realizing like, I don't have to follow every thought. Every thought isn't reality. It's my model of reality, right? It's incredibly different. Like what makes a confident person versus a neurotic person if they've both given a speech and somebody's heckled them or something, right? It's the meaning they make about that heckle. And if I don't know that I'm the one making that meaning, the neurotic person is believing it, and then they're really bad because there's a heckle and they've failed, and the confident person is just making a different meaning. Like, I'm sorry you're upset, okay, but I still got my message out and that's fine, and I'm going to go do it again. And so just changing from neurotic to confident is a beginning of, can I master the meaning making in my thinking? And then the even bigger deal is, can I ground myself into a presence in isness, which is this present moment primarily. To your point, all the thoughts are isness too. They're just so narrow and attached. They're not broad and have the space of potential creativity and change, right? Because there's nothing but options in front of us, but our thought would tell us this has to happen. This is the only way to win. I have to do this or I'm not good enough, etc. Right? And so getting free of some of those, right on that path, many options open up. I might abandon that path altogether and have all these other options if I have freedom and more control over my thinking and my attention and the meaning that I'm making.
Lovely. Yeah, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, drawing a parallel with a lot of cognitive therapy. You've probably heard this before.
Sure.
There's a lot of, techniques and principles. And I will say that the classic cognitive behavioral therapy that has become, more manualized and more widespread, lacks a little in philosophical grounding to really explain those techniques, but the techniques work. And it is a lot about the cognitive flexibility, this broadening of, of considering alternatives, of not getting too attached and too tied to the meaning of a specific thing that happened when you try to present something and it didn't work out, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
This attachment to the meanings of specific interpretations. But I don't know if you would agree that this goes a step deeper than that, of not just considering alternatives, that's part of it, the broadening of the scope, but also the complete detachment, right?
Yes.
Any identification whatsoever.
So I love that, right? So as you're attached, the part that you're not seeing is what you're identified with, which you imagine is you. That's the self that you're looking through in the moment that feels like the agent in the arena, okay? And I can give examples of how that shrinks and gets bigger and is shifting whether you realize it or not. Gaining the skill to be able to shift that is really interesting. And I think when I'm talking to most people who identify as selves and are not free of the self in a meaningful way yet, they're most interested in that cognitive therapy stuff. It's like, how do I go from anxious to confident? Like, that's all I want to do. The deeper and much more profound philosophical point here is, if I have a real identification with isness, or let's just say access to experiencing isness more purely, I value different things. Now I value this moment, which is actually really the thing that you and I share, right? That's where you and I could really meet. If we are selves, we're meeting in a model about each other, right? And those models are not the same. The more they align and are similar, the more we will probably get along, but they're not the same. If you could think about, being intimate with a partner, right, in the bedroom or something, that when those moments are the most beautiful, and of course, role play could be fun. Like, we could get weird with it. Like, you could be in thought and have a good time there. But what, quote unquote, like making love usually is when there's no thought, there's just presence, there's just the smells and the tastes and the touches and the feelings. And those are magical. And it's that's available without the partner. Like you can have that just in the moment. Like I could focus on, the tingles going up my back now and just be very, very happy and present. And that lowers what I need as a human. That lowers, I'm not now lacking and I need to get something to be complete. I am complete and it's beautiful and I value different things, right? So imagine if all of humanity were to value like that, not because they believe in it, but because that's what they wake up into in a truly meaningful way. We don't want to now go to war. There's no reason to fight. Like that, it just it solves, and that might be too big a jump logically to defend in this moment. I'd be happy to if it's interesting, but like that's really what's so much more profound is that my value structure goes from caring about what the self cares about, which is transient and temporary and based on what other people think of me and security things and all the security stuff, like my own life even, right, doesn't have the same concern or protection when I can wake up into isness and arrive in a way that's truly grounded, right, in this moment in a profound way.
I like this notion about values because and how you described how you acquire your standard values when we are and attached to our identity, because we learn our values, we learn what's good and bad, and we get shaped by all these institutions and whatever the broader society values, or what our parents value, what others that we identify with value. But it seems that if then we shift into living more grounded in experience, right, in the now, in this perennial now, the values become more transcendent then, because they're not tied to specific contexts or specific existing value structures or people. They're just whatever, I guess, overall is good or bad, if that makes sense.
Well, it's almost a dissolution of good or bad into this gets probably logically challengeable, but because I don't have the words to do it well. If you can really put down what I call duality can be described a lot of different ways, but the duality of good and bad, that valence quality of toward away, push pull, in out, up down, all those opposites, right? If you can look at something for what it is, which by the way is it's less, it's not more. This isn't hard to do. Everybody can do this.
That's interesting.
The loudness is the adding on, right? It's the automacy of like a quick judgment, etc. So it's the being with something without the judgment, where you get a more direct, naked, exact, like a presence with it, and where that lives, like where our closest access to that is through our sensations, right? Whether that's visual or audio or whatever. Something I was talking about actually with Greg recently was the idea that what if we thought of the self as another sense? Okay. And I can get back to values in a second, but this might be valuable. Like my vision is a sense. It's very different than the quality of my hearing as a sense. They're both interpretations of things that go on out here, but they're very different access to those things. If we were to lump in that evolutionarily, maybe the addition of thinking with some of those senses leads to emotions, which we could think of as a sense, right? Like all of a sudden fear comes up and I sense fear in a way, right? If I just, we'll be loose with what these words maybe mean for a second, but it's like, you could imagine emotions are another way of sensing, right? It's not a direct to experience, it's a plus my own interpretation. Well, the highest level.
Objectives, right?
Will
depend on how close or how far away you are from that objective.
Totally. And many of those are unconscious to us. So, a whole nother dimension of this is like how much of this is conscious and how much of this is like patterned into the system that's unconscious, right, within us. But if you think of emotions as potentially another sense, like a way to just be guided by an interpretation, because my vision is an interpretation. I don't see everything. It's my body's ability.
Right.
Like I could be colorblind. You might not be. We're not seeing the same thing. I have a perception that's my interpretation visually. I have an interpretation audio. I have an interpretation of taste. I also have an interpretation of what scares me, what does whatever. An even higher level of a sense is the self story that is having all those perceptions, right? It's like that's almost like the way that all those get simplified into one story.
The major sense, then, if you think
Yes.
about it that way, right?
The major sense of our time, right? This is what I think of that level 4 on Greg's thing of the cultural human mind, is we are primarily that sense walking around, identified as it, rather than realizing it's a way to make sense of the world.
Okay. Now, let me get a little bit more into that, because now I got curious.
Yes,
You mentioned the level 4. Are you talking about the SBA model? And we can explain what that is to folks, but is that what you were referring to?
I'm talking about the tree of knowledge level 4, like the culture person level, right? So,
you're talking about the 4th.
which includes the ESPA model and all that stuff, right? So that whole, which Greg's work dissects so well, I'm saying if we oversimplify that and go that whole ESPA model, which we're not that good at the A part, right? The ESP,
Can I explain what that is? Because
yes,
no clue, but yes,
the ESP part of that is the let's say the Freudian model of, drives and ego and persona, right? That those whole things together into the sense of a self is like the easiest way to go, oh, that's the way this system is perceiving this. That's what's telling me what's right and wrong, what I'm supposed to do, in the same way vision might tell me what to do. And so a lot of spiritual people would say, oh, the ego is bad, and we're supposed to transcend the ego, because they can feel that this transcendence is different than the ego. And so they all of a sudden vilify that and say, well, this is non-dual. One problem with that is that you can't make non-dual good and duality bad, because that's just duality again, right? That's just good and bad again.
But so ESBA, just so people know, goes for ego, self, and persona, where self is experiential self. So that's all of your senses, your needs, all those things, right, that tie you to the world and your rules and your identity. So it's at that pre-verbal primate level of just experiencing. Needing things and having objectives and balancing good and bad. Your ego is then your narrating self that interprets the world and it makes meaning, propositional meaning out of things and those sensations and etc. And then the persona aspect is then the private to public filter, is how you present to others, how you regulate your image, and what you communicate and what you filter out, etc. So that's what that stands for. NDA is awareness. So that's pure awareness that, as I understand it, seems very akin to the isness. Right. This.
Well, it's watcher, right? So it's a watcher. It's identifying as the observer, right? So all of a sudden, I'm not attached as the self. I can back up to watch the self as a sense. Okay. So I'm playing with this with you, right? If an emotion could be sort of thrown into a sense, right? If you imagine that there's the literal senses of that experiential self that you just mentioned, right? We might also say it's the impulses and the drives that kind of come up automatically out of the unconscious or something, right? And some of those might be like, likes and dislikes, et cetera, that are a little even thought about it, right? And then our ego is like taking that impulse as a sense and making a story about it. And then it's actually taking the persona and how do I want to represent and be seen here, right? There's a lot of complexity to that. Each one of those can be objectified to be looked at and not identified with, right? If I am the anger that happens to me, that's not as evolved as if I backed up to be an ego that's considering my anger and doing whatever with it, et cetera. But there's pathologies at any of those levels, right? If I'm too egoic, that's not great. A lot of people are codependent or maybe lost in persona. Their persona is too important to them and they've lost their connection to their egoic self, et cetera. What I'm saying here is, in the same way I wouldn't want to lose my vision, I also don't want to lose my sense of self necessarily, right? Like, it is a good way to perceive, unless it's malformed, right? Unless it's broken. And that's where the fundamental shift gives you access to see this self in a meaningful way, where we actually get perspective on the self in a profound way through that awareness function that we're talking about. And then if that's malformed, identity shifting is what can heal some of those balances so that the self can show up differently. Because it's incredible. Our natural state for most people now is to walk online as the self. They're identified as that self. And that self identifies very differently depending on what the context is and whether they're a parent or whether they're actively parenting right now, or et cetera, right? The size of that self can get bigger and smaller. But this is a lot for somebody who hasn't heard any of this stuff before, but it's
Yeah, and I will leave in the description, all the links, and if you have
Okay.
specific material you would like me to link people to, I can
Sure.
add that in too. So let me rephrase just to make sure that I got it. The fundamental shift is this shift in your mode of being. Let's say, and you can correct me if I get something wrong. It's the shift from experiencing the world from this first person perspective that is totally tied to the identities and the roles that you're associated with and the interpretations you make in the world of this ego self persona aspect of you, right? That is essential, crucial. I mean, we wouldn't have evolved it for nothing.
Yes,
right?
totally. Right.
But it's the shift from living in that and being all of that to realizing that there's also an awareness observing function that is not tied to any of that necessarily, and that you actually hold in common, right, with other people. I mean, ego self persona, that is uniquely yours in a way, as it's tied to your identity, but the awareness not so much, right? It's a mode. One way for me to frame it that helps me, it's that meta observation, right? The MO in common mode. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that there's different levels of experiencing this and how grounded it is in you, right? So the first level would be like kind of understanding what we're talking about. I think everybody could get it if I say, hey, like most of us are walking around, if I speak for myself, like I'm walking around as Rob, right? If you ask me like, what am I, like, I'm Rob and I've got these goals and I've got these fears and I've got these, like, I'm identified as Rob. The fundamental shift is taking very seriously to say that that is not a permanent structure. It is a psychological self that is capable of change and is changing all the time, et cetera. And what's more persistent and real than that in some sense is that there is an awareness function that is prior to that sense of self, right? That can in fact watch that sense of self in a way. And so, so just let's say those phases, like understanding that that's true would be a bit of a fundamental shift for somebody. Like, oh, wow, like I'm kind of not myself. I don't really know what that means. I don't know how to do it, whatever. We start to play with this. And this is what almost any meditation technique is trying to do, whether they're saying it or not. But it's like, can you detach from the thinking and the modeling that you're doing as a self about things and just be in awareness of what is, whether that's awareness that you're thinking or awareness of your breath or awareness of a mantra or whatever, right? So that starts to back us up into, oh, I'm in awareness. A deeper, more profound is to actually identify as that awareness, maybe even more primarily than as the self, right? And that might take a bit to get there, but it doesn't take any time. Like it's available to all of us in any moment. Most people with this might go like, I'm a self here, and then I'm going to go meditate for 10 minutes and be in awareness for a second, but they don't give that the same level of importance as I'm suggesting, right? That just the understanding that that is more you than the self that you're running around in. It's more permanent. It's like this function. And then what's happening on top of that is a selving function, which is the organism's ability to identify as things because it's a shortcut. I don't want to have to compute everything all the time. So I make rules that I carry and I remember and I boot them up and I look at the world through those rules. That all of that is the structure of and the beauty of the self, right? It's a way to coarse grain down the infinity into manageable chunks of attention and focus and relevance, right? And so as I identify in one way as a self, and here's another example of like identity shifting. I could be at a party, super confident, having the best time, and then an ex-girlfriend walks in and it changes everything, right? The context changed. What I remember, the meaning that makes, what becomes important to me, my values have shifted, what I'd like to get out of the night. Maybe now I'd like to run or go yell at her or whatever, like it just all changes. And in the center of that, if you imagine somebody who's much more in touch with awareness, they would just watch those impulses come up. They wouldn't have to be acted on in the same way. They don't have to be whatever. And they're all beautiful because there's not a constant comparison and I'm supposed to be feeling better all the time, because that's also the function of the self. That's the judging, optimizing, what am I supposed to be doing function of a self, right? So the awareness goes, anything is beautiful. Let me see what's going on. And that's how we can value this moment and the fact that we're awake more than the story of the self winning and I'm the best and people love me and I'm rich and whatever those things are. it doesn't negate any of those things. I can still be the self and want to win at all those things, but I'm not as attached to them. And I'm not as attached to, the fear of death and all these different things. Like all of those can be right-sized in my valuation, which you might imagine might be a big jump, but then we don't need to go to war in the same way. And we don't need to, I don't need the same material things. I may want them. I have tons of material things, but I'm not as attached to them. If you were to take them away, I would survive that and be fine. And I know that because, I enjoy them and I value them to some degree, but I'm not lost in it. I'm not lost in the story that comes.
Consumed by it.
I'm not consumed. Yeah.
Something that defines your beingness in the world.
Yes.
One thing that I find beautiful about that is this detachment, like using that example, it must allow you to have much more self-compassion, right? And compassion for others. Because you're no longer judging yourself for the things that you feel and your desires. And whenever you're in a party and your ex walks in and you have hostility or shame or guilt or whatever it is. We talk about the triple negative neurotic loop.
Yes.
Where you have a negative situation, a negative feeling, a natural, negative reaction that you get because of a negative situation. And then you judge yourself for that. And you
it's a disaster.
Blame or you control. And then it's an endless cycle of just reactivity, right?
The beginning of this starts to laugh at that, right? Like you'll see that. You'll have that impulse and you're like, oh, I'm doing that again. That's so sad.
And how interesting is that? How curious, how funny.
Yeah. And then later it doesn't happen at all. Like it just isn't, it doesn't make sense to do that anymore, right? Let me give an example of the self-awareness that might be necessary here, right? And I usually it's an old show now. I know this is in a different country, so I don't know if you have any access to this at all, but I'm curious if you know the Jersey Shore. Do you remember that MTV show?
Gosh. Yes, I remember
Okay.
that.
So it was a bunch of partiers and, just not, you wouldn't argue hugely self-aware, right? They're probably not like lining up to go to therapy to work on themselves, right? They like to drink, they like to party, and they're young, they're kids, right? So none of this is to critique any of them. But let's take one of them and imagine them in a bar. You could imagine, and you could maybe watch the hours and hours and hours of the show of them doing this. They're basically blaming everyone else, right? A self who's like completely unaware isn't looking at itself. It's looking out here. It's like, Tanya did this to me, and Steve then said that, and I'm not the one who's the problem. And through that, they begin lying and they begin doing all these things, right? There's all this dysfunction at that level of self-consciousness. You could imagine somebody else at that same bar talking to a similar friend, saying all those critiques. I don't like that happened. I don't like that happened, but I don't know if I'm involved, right? They start to go, maybe I'm the problem, right? There's a way that they've begun to objectify the self. They haven't not identified. They're still identified as the self, but there's a way to go, wait, I want to hold part of this in front of me to look at it. And that's the kind of person that's ready for coaching or therapy or something, because they're now ready to go, let's put this out on the table and look at it. My level is maybe one level beyond that, which is, I can actually put down the self and really witness it without even trying to change it. And you were talking about self-compassion. It is a higher version of self-identification away from the, we'll say, lesser version that's really impulsive and judging and not owning their own stuff at all. It's the most self-aware. And through that, it can be the most self-loving, right? So if, as I'm Rob, some impulse comes up or whatever, I don't have to have a lot of guilt about it because I know that's what the self does. Like that's what it's about. And I don't have to act on it. So that bad impulse doesn't lead to 1,000 bad behaviors and friends hating me and all the, I can actually take the high road, not because I want to win or be loved later, but because that's like the wise thing to do. And I can then again value like, I saw myself get attached to something that didn't come true. Let me value again just the fact that I'm here. Something that's been different about me, even before my really profound wake up, I was like, how are we not talking constantly about the fact that it's just weird that we're here, right? Like I'm pink and I have 10 fingers and toes and like, what are we doing? This is so weird. Why are we fighting with each other? What's happening? So at a very profound level, there's an awe in this awareness that can come online, right? I talk about dropping good and bad. There's a different kind of good or beauty or something that can come through when I choose that, because it's even a pain in my side. If I drop the valence of that pain, the fact that anything is happening is has beauty in it, right? There's something beautiful there. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not capable of preferring something more ecstatic or beautiful or whatever. Like you still can, those preferences, that access to self is still there, but I have the real access to go, oh, I've got all this back pain. Can that be beautiful too? Right. And then what?
It's sensible, right? Like you can still be aware and cognizant that there are all these, the solving function, which I really like that term, by the way.
Yeah.
Function. That's
Yeah.
kind of really good. It's different from, it's more dynamic than thinking of a unitary self,
Yes.
around. It's like a dynamic function that's happening.
Yeah.
Much more processed.
And that's it. I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's a really big wake up all by itself. And that's a part of the fundamental shift, right? The self to function, it has to believe it's a thing, right? Like that's the power of it. It's like, I have to value my life so much that I immediately run without thinking about it when there's danger, or I immediately punch if that seems like the best thing. A lot of those are impulsive and quick, right? I'm doing those really fast. And for survival, that's been really important. Right. So believing yourself is a big deal. Having the realization of, wait, I'm not always the same self. Like as soon as I change what I value or what's going on. And one example of that is like, if you're in a car and somebody bumps your car, it's logical to go, you hit me, right? Mm-hmm. Like they didn't hit you, they hit your car. Right. And right, like if you punch my arm, in one moment I could take you to court and go, look, I've been assaulted. She hit me, right? Mm-hmm. But if all of a sudden my arm isn't working because of that, and I want to go do jujitsu or play baseball, in some sense, my arm is a bit of it's like I'm mad at my arm. It's like I now have an arm and it's like away from me. It's like I want to do this, but my arm won't let me.
My arm is not letting me.
Right. And then if I meditate, this sense of self, if I'm like looking for where's the self and I just go right into experience, it's like, oh, that whole self isn't even online in this moment. Like it's not there at all. I'm just pure consciousness. Right. And then the bigger side of that is I could start identifying like, well, I'm very similar to all these other people, or let's go not as enlightened as that. If I were to go give my life for my country and be working for the army, it's because I'm identified, in my case, as an American, right? And through that could drive my motivations and my choices. And I might give up my own individual life in service of this bigger identity, which is this country that I'm. So our identity is shifting all the time. The last example I'll give is if I'm walking with my kids in the city, I want to have control over my kids, not because I just don't want them walking into traffic or getting mugged or whatever. So you might watch me like get angry and barky and like, come over here, do that, because I want to have control over them like I have control over my own arm. Like I want to protect them because I'm identified as, them. Like they're now in the we space of me, and strangers aren't, right? They're dangerous. This is what I'm protecting. And I would actually take a bullet for the child, right? Like so to those degrees where our identity is constantly, as a function of solving, expanding and going littler. And, you could be with your partner and feel very in love and it's us against them. Right now it's us. All of a sudden one word is said and now she's my enemy. In fact, maybe my worst enemy in that moment. Right. And so people go, yeah, but I'm always Rob. It's like, yeah, but not really. The self that's there and the motivations and the things that drive selfishness itself are changing all the time. And if it's possible to put that down or identify differently in any moment, isn't that a skill of identity shifting that we would want to understand and be able to deal with, right? Like that's what's so important. And I mentioned the unconscious before, just because this isn't confusing enough yet. Even if you get the fundamental shift in a really profound way and you go, oh, any thought that might pop up, I can manage it, like at a Buddha level, right? Like I'm amazing at this. You can sit a human in a white room with no stimulus at all, and somebody who's anxious could put themselves in a panic attack just by imagining, right? So even if you have Buddha level of escaping thoughts that are there, you're still going to have thoughts come up. And so those are the unconscious patterns of our traumas, et cetera, that get served up to us whenever, right? Like just as it needs be. So there's a conscious mastery over this, which is where we're starting. What's your attention doing? Can you focus in this way? Can you change meaning? But then there's what are those unconscious patterns? Because even if you had a Buddha level attention to deal with whatever meaning might come up, you probably don't want, I am terrible, I should have never been born, or whatever those, just being the backdrop. So another part of the identity shifting part of this is going back and repatterning some of finding them, because often they're outside of our awareness, they're unconscious to us, finding some of those negative patterns and optimizing those so that the self that automatically can come online is, happier, more fulfilled, more confident, more capable, etc. Right? So
Yeah. I was going to bring up some. We're getting close to time here, but
sure.
I want to bring this up because some people may hear this and be like, okay, but we can't always be in experience. We can't always be outside the self. I have to go back to self, and the self is really painful because somebody has these traumas or just a dispositional tendency, toward neuroticism and just suffer more than others, have a higher, more heightened experience of negative emotionality. And there are moments where it's much easier, to fall into isness and enjoy, or not enjoy, but, just be present without valence, without attachment. And others, it's really hard. Like if you're suffering, if you're going through a neurotic loop that's constantly, telling you that you're worthless or whatever it is.
Someone just broke up with you, whatever, like all the things, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you frame that, or how do you see that, the distinction between falling into isness when you're having a great time and things are going good in your life versus when you're suffering or you're going through misery? I know that you found your awakening during a moment of suffering.
Yeah.
Right? Overall. So,
So that is why it is a shift. And then it's almost like wake up and grow up, right? So the wake up gives us access to go, oh, this self isn't as permanent as I thought it was. I can leave it experientially, potentially, from time to time. Doesn't even mean that it's long, but just I have access to getting outside this. Now it's been objectified, and maybe I can change some of this stuff. So one of the things that we do is we look for what are the unconscious patterns that are driving you? What are the base level, I call them lenses, that are invisible to you, but they're changing how you perceive things. And as you find those, number one, maybe we just talk about lenses for a second. I can just give what those are. Yeah. So lenses are a really good concept to explain to us some of our default meaning making and belief systems. And I would argue that any thought is potentially a lens, depending on how powerful and how much we're attached to it. But if the analogy is this: if you think about any lens, microscope, telescope, glasses, contacts, the function of a lens, it really has two functions. We're all aware of one of them, right? If I put on lenses, they alter how I see the world, right? These are correcting my vision. If they were rose-colored, I would see rose-colored, etc. The second function of a lens that nobody really thinks about is they're built to be invisible, meaning I don't consider these glasses. I can, but as soon as I consider the glasses, they're not altering my view in the same way. But if I were to take them off and look at them, they're not doing their first function in the same way. So they're built to almost be forgotten, right? Our belief structures are very much like that. They are deeply altering how we perceive the world, and they're built to be invisible to us. And that's a function of the self. That's not a negative thing, right? This is the coarse graining of the difficult stuff. If I learn something important, take it in, don't have to recompute it. Now that's my truth, right? So I equate belief with truth, meaning if it's truly a belief, it's so deep to you that you think it's real, right? It's like that is a truth to me. So part of healing people that are dysfunctional is actually breaking up with their current truths about themselves that are malformed, right? Current truths about their history that are malformed, that for many of them, if they're attached to them, would be deeply offended by saying that, right? But I'll use like a silly one just to do it. I will literally have a client come to me and go, I am a loser, right? And it's like, okay, but like, what does that mean? Well, I lost this, I lost that, I lost the other. There might be all of these facts and all of these reasons that seems like a reasonable belief to have. But for that person to change, that has to become untrue at some point, right? They have to actually go, oh, I'm not a loser. Yes, I've lost, but it's not useful to believe I am a loser, because if I look at the world as I am a loser, I'm basically looking for, how do I make that true? How do I find the loss somehow, right?
Yeah.
And then I want other people to win, or maybe I'm really self-sabotaging, or there's a self-fulfilling prophecy in there. If I think, my partner always cheats on me, or partners in general always cheat on me, that's going to change maybe how I act so much that before you know it, my partner will cheat on me because she's getting blamed for it anyway, et cetera, right? So there's ways that these sort of manifest themselves. And I don't mean in magical ways. I mean in just very literal ways. But if you're perceiving that about yourself, that's not how you want to live anyway.
Yeah,
So
and I think that makes, just to say that it's not in magical ways. I think it does make sense. It is compatible with a lot of what we know in psychotherapy,
mhm,
because we tend to try to validate why it was adaptive at some point.
totally,
For instance,
totally.
to build some maladaptive response that they've built. Like
Yes.
maybe they were in an abusive situation for many years, and now they're super defensive with certain behaviors or whatever it is. And that was adaptive at some point, but the context is different. And then they're still using those lenses, but it is recreating the self-fulfilling prophecy because the context is different and sort of pulling those same dynamics,
Totally.
same vicious cycles.
Yeah, and we can honor these lenses in a lot of ways because they're probably how we survive certain things, right?
Right.
They were the rightest meaning in the moment that let us get to here, which is great. But to your point, the context has now changed, and maybe it's not the same. It's not as adaptive, or it's really hurting us every day. And what I like to say about the subconscious, I'm not the only one. Lots of people say this is it's people think that it's a pleasure pain dichotomy that we're after. I would argue that the subconscious is actually way more interested in the familiar. It's trying to avoid chaos and danger and move toward the familiar because the familiar worked before, and it will actually leave us in very painful.
Familiar.
Yeah, it will leave us in very painful scenarios, right? The battered woman who won't leave because the unknown is scarier than the known abuse that she's going through is just one of those examples, right? People in addiction, and for lots of different reasons, we can find ourselves what we would call comfortable, and then justify as, well, that's just me. Like this, I am a loser, or I am an addict, or I never marry the right guy. Those become the story of the self as a deep self lens about who they are and what the world is. And if we can't objectify and get outside that self, we don't even have the way to start messing with those lenses. So each of us is absolutely unique. We have our own unique perspective. We have our own unique thing. This work is trying to make the claim that while we're unique, there's a definite structure of what that self is and what it's doing and what it's motivated by. And the fundamental shift allows you to begin seeing that identity shifting are the tools to go in and, shift this and change that so that we can be a really highly level realized self that's capable, confident, showing up, doing the thing, and all that stuff, right? And lenses is a foundational part of that, dealing with the unconscious patterns that we can't see about ourselves because they're being lived through, right? Just like the lens you can't see, it's being, it's altering what we see, but we can't see it happening because we don't see the lens yet.
And just one more comment about them, just tying to just something you said earlier. They are sort of giving continuity to a self that's ever changing, right? So they're bringing that familiarity of something in the past or something subconscious.
Yes.
That is bringing that continuity so that perhaps a sense of safety there, right?
Totally.
Stability when that self is just constantly changing with the context, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So these lenses cause set points for us that are comfortable and familiar. They then lead to patterns of behavior in the world, right? That are the habits that seem so hard to break, et cetera. How we eat, right? If a 100-pound over woman who's come to me wants to lose weight, if I can change her identity from I'm a loser who isn't my word to myself into, no, I am an athlete, and she looks through that lens, she might be a 100-pound overweight athlete, but athletes have a whole other behavior set underneath, right? An athlete feeds themselves well. They're active. They do this, they do that. And in this case, that's what it takes to actually change this person. And all of us usually think that's a willpower move where I have to sort of, I would argue that willpower is necessary when what's not natural for me, I have a part of myself that wants to do it, so I have to force myself to do something that's not natural. Why willpower eventually works is that I've done it long enough that my subconscious takes on, oh, this is a part of me and it's natural, and now there's no resistance. Through identity shifting, we actually change that subconscious thing first so that we don't have to use willpower in the same way and sort of fake it. It shifts you here first, and then the behaviors follow naturally.
Yeah, and the willpower, oftentimes, it tries to change behavior through self-hate, power my way through this because I'm all the way here and I want to get all the way there. Changing the lenses, it's a little different. Like, it's a total different process. It's not really getting from here to here. It's like, okay, I can shift the way that I view the world into
Yeah.
this other lens, and they're flexible,
Yeah.
so I can sort of play with these lenses in a way, right?
Totally. Well, they also end up being like really linked in ways that people don't see until we can start do work like this, right? So if you back up and go, okay, let's say I don't like my body and I feel like I'm overweight. That might lead to, well, I don't have enough willpower because I can't keep eating the right way and I can't keep going to the gym, but I also don't have enough time. I also, I'm not a quality person because I can't keep my word to myself. And we end up just bouncing back and forth between these justifications of why I'm not in some idealized thing that I'm attached to as a self that's supposed to be different than what I am. So I haven't accepted what I am. I'm not really doing the things to change. And I have all these lenses and reasons as to why. And that becomes my story that I'm sharing. And so guess what? My friendships become with other people that like those stories, and we get to send memes back and forth and bitch about how we're not who we like to be and whatever, right? And then we're just eating Cheetos to feel better about it. And it's this cycle of Cheeto pleasure rather than profound pleasure of any kind. And, missing out on actually doing any of the things that would really lead to a self that's proud of itself and does follow through and does eat better and finds that easier and easier, et cetera, right? So it's one lens can have all of these other implications, and then finding a network of lenses like that can be really like exposing that and going, oh, I'm doing that again. Look at that. Coming back to your breath, getting present, going, well, just I'm going to go to the gym now, right? Like it's that easy to change, because we break up with being attached to the gym. Doesn't come with like, you don't go to the gym and then you look great, right? It's a habit that happens over time. So what takes me back to the gym is not the value of I'm going to have washboard abs. It's that I'm really proud of myself that I went to the gym, right? So it's changing all of those things and realizing, wow, what are the real motivators here? What are the real ways that I'm going to be doing these behavior changes as a self? And again, this is why it's identity shifting. This isn't escaping self only. It's having that access to that so that we can come back into self and be profoundly different as people, right?
And honor the process of solving.
Totally.
How dynamic and how available it is to be intervened.
Yeah.
Because when you jump out, you detach.
Yeah.
You're able to have this meta view of what's going on in your context. Then you actually have the time.
Yeah.
Okay, how do I want to go about this? You can choose what you do next. And that's very, very difficult if you're just living in the stream of your
well, if you're attached to the truth of I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't follow through on things, and if that's the background stuff, then that's going to be incredibly difficult too, right? I mean, it usually takes some, your best friend dying of a heart attack or something to shock you into, oh, I'm definitely going to go, or like it's those are the things that usually would lead to some profound change. But most of us are just slogging through the same old story. If you go read your diary, it probably reads pretty similar to 10 years ago because, I'm still going to write my book one day and I'm still going to do whatever, but it's all of this not there yet thing. It's not an alive celebration of like, this is amazing and I have all this access to be able to do all these things that I want to do and love the process of that. Totally unrelated, if we were to back up a bunch of minutes, I said that we can sort of go and love this self that's messy, right? We can see, oh, I'm selving again and I got attached, or wow, that lens, gosh, I'm doing that lensing again. In the same way, when somebody else is difficult, that's my path to love them too. Even if this self totally differs and we don't agree with what happened or what we should value or how we should be talking to each other, whatever. If I have access to leaving this, I can love me. Oh, you got attached to winning that argument. They're doing that too. I can love the fact that we're selving. When I say love, maybe have care for or have compassion for, etc.
That brings me to comment Mo. We have loving compassion.
Yes.
Mo. And that's such a tricky one because like when you do something that you regret, like you hate yourself for it, you feel guilty, ashamed, it's really hard to have compassion for yourself sometimes, especially for people who are high in neuroticism for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Or when you're treated unfairly by somebody.
Totally.
It's so hard to have compassion for that person.
Well, it's very difficult as a self, right?
And then you can
as awareness though, or as isness, there's a different perspective to go, oh, selves are selfish. That self is going to be selfish and I'm being selfish too. And that's so
normal for me to react as a primate.
Of course. I still may not like it in the story of Rob. I still wish it went differently. I still wish I could have trusted that, whatever. that all remains true to whatever degree. But to what degree do I want to identify that and be so burnt up about it? Or can I just go, of course they're solving, right? I've had clients that have kids that they've taken skiing, and all of a sudden the kid brought a friend, and the kid doesn't want to ski with the parent. The parent's like personally like offended by that. But what is the path to seeing that, right? Well, you could go like, I could imagine being a kid with a friend. You want to be cool. You're trying to be as adult as possible. You don't want to like hold your dad's hand down the mountain. You want to be like off free with your friend. And there's a way to love that and go like, look at my daughter grow up, or look at my son, whatever, right? But I can't stay identified to what myself wants to do that very well. If I'm super attached to me and what my outcomes are, which is the day I'd planned, loving skiing with my daughter, I have to be able to, how do I get free of that attachment? Go, oh, I got attached to something. She's attached to something different. And I can at least, at minimum, understand it. And and then maybe even have compassion and love.
Can I even identify with that? Like going through your point, right?
Yeah.
When have I felt that excitement? Desire to do something that's
totally. Then I can talk to her about it on the drive out. Did you guys have fun? Like, were you safe? What happened? Oh,
the borders open up, right?
Unbelievable. It's totally different, right? So it's a whole different way to live, and there's a lot that we can get to very quickly with quick little tips like that. And there's deeply profound things here too, should that be important, or what people want to get out of it. So yeah, I'm trying to stand for, that putting down our attachment to self as deeply as we are, going, okay, there's this watcher position, isness, awareness, whatever we want to call it, that's back here. There's an actual process of identifying with and as that awareness a little bit more deeply, which is really, that might be the most profound level that we need to talk about. But even being able to do it is pretty profound. And prior to that is just understanding that it might even be a thing, going, oh, let me see what that is all of those are
right. I imagine that's something that needs to be practiced, much like the MO. I feel like there's a lot of similarities between that concept. And people who are watching this probably will be familiar at this point with the MO, because we posted on our page about it. And that was actually the last question I wanted to ask you. How can people practice this perspective shift? Exercise it? What would you recommend?
Well, let me do this. Here's what's really neat. So one is, it's the self that thinks of practice, because the self is living in time, and the self is expecting this to be a skill that they have, quote unquote, always, or that has happened. The actuality of this is there's no path to this. It's here in any moment, right? So if it's not here in this moment, you're still identified as self. As soon as you maybe move your focus to your breath or begin to watch these processes, it's right here. There is no other place to get to. There's no path to this. It's a realization. It's a wake up. And it doesn't matter. The more awake you are, the less you'll try to hold on to it, because you'll realize, oh, it's always here. So even if I get lost in self again, I can just do it again later. So I'm not worried about holding it, right? It's the self that wants to hold it and have it. So there's that. That said, the self that does want it, thinking about it as a practice and practicing it doesn't hurt. But to really get it, you'll get away from the practice part of it and just be like, oh, this is something I have access to, and claim it, right? It's like, I want to invite people to claim this. This is something that you can all do. It's the taste of a strawberry. It's what your feet feel like on the floor. Getting that to be more profound for you, whether that takes time for yourself or whether it's you just have it in a realization. It can be either of those. So, claim more of it.
Claim it right now. I can claim it right now.
Claim it right now. Yeah. And then just start playing with it and be like, I know what that is. I might not always be doing it, but like, I know what that is. And then you might want to do it more and more as you notice yourself getting attached and as suffering kind of comes along with that. The practices I have, obviously they can go to my website. There's a ton of free resources. I have a free course called The Power of Identity Shifting that has a lot of visuals around these lenses, and it's got a lot.
You're great at visuals. I remember your PowerPoint.
Yeah. I should have brought some here. Like there's neat ways to visualize this so that we could see it and understand it more. I also have a free back to breath challenge, which is really shows that as an anchor, why do mindfulness and meditation practices use breath? It's because automatically that has a sensation just easily, in our body. And if we close down the visual center and just kind of come back to breath, it's a good anchor to know what to come back to as awareness, as a starting place, but it also can open into more nowness, if you will. And there's a good way to almost, I use it as a mantra in the world to go like, when you notice yourself revving up into self, go, whoa, stop, back to breath, right? Just stop, back to breath. And it's just a move of attention, like I talked about in the beginning, to come back to your breath as a grounding. That gets more profound if you sort of add that is the fundamental shift, right? It's just a move out of thought into experience, and, you know, in the practice sense of it, getting better at that, having that be more automatic and more regular. I have other tools and all that stuff, but stop back to breath is not a bad practice at all.
That's
and understanding,
one. And,
yeah,
you know, I think easy enough at least to do at given times, because that is hard to stay at breath, right?
yes, yeah,
Or no practice with meditation and things like that. But it's a beautiful one to just to try it out and begin playing with that shifting.
yeah. Can I give that? So if you sit down to practice meditation, even a minute at a time, it doesn't matter, right? There's what you're doing there is, all you're doing is you're trying to go, not, okay, I have to drop thought because that's just another thought. It's actually just moving your attention. It's drop thought. It's not new thought. It's drop thought and come to this attention, and then notice when it goes out here and come back. There's two ways generally that's going to go for you. In the beginning, it's going to go this way. A lot of thought, a lot of thought, a lot of thought. And what's amazing about that is a great practice, because the more that you're wrestling with that, it's like doing reps at the gym. You're getting good at, there's another impulsive thought that myself has coming online. Don't do the triple negative neurotic loop, right? Don't do the I'm so bad at this thing. Just go, nope. Every time I see it, it's a win if I can just come back to my breath, even for a second. Then what will often happen for people is that time with breath will start to widen, and there will be more of like an open gap of isness there, right? Just a sensing and a presencing, and it'll feel more grounded and more like home. That is also an incredibly successful sit, tends to be easier. What most people do is they say that's the good sit and the thinking one is the bad sit. Don't do that. There's no point to that. The act of practicing this, which by the way, you can be doing in any moment. Like I could invite everybody right now, what do your feet feel like? You're doing it. What does your breath feel like? You're doing it. And ultimately, stillness and motion is a connection to both of those realms, being in action and talking to you, but very embodied and aware at the same time. They both can come online at the same time. And so when you're listening to somebody and you notice you're thinking too much, can you go stop, back to breath, back to listening and presence, right? Like this is all through your life. You can do this. When I'm trying to do my taxes and I want to be doing something else, can I make the taxes the focus, right? That's just moving my attention to presence and what's really here for me. I did want to say one other thing. I know I'm saying a lot, but there's out of thought and into breath or presence, right? Or nowness and sensation of any kind. Gratitude is another simple one that is the ability to change the meaning of something or move a meaning over to another thought. So if I go from whatever my basic thought is, it might be a neurosis or it might be just a fantasy or whatever, to a conscious practice of gratitude, I'm manifesting a positive thought by just moving my attention in another way. But instead of coming into experience, I'm coming into what's one of the most foundational good feelings we can have, which is what am I thankful for? What am I grateful for? Right?
Yeah, I think it gets closer to psychological mindfulness.
Totally. Right. Exactly.
The MO. It's like
right.
The meta observation, not just of your sensation,
yeah,
but also of your mental.
So we have another practice called 3G3, which is 3 grounded breaths, 3 gratitudes, and then 3 more grounded breaths. And for those that are getting a little bit more advanced in this, you start to notice the difference between, oh, that's moving a thought around and getting flexible and changing my meaning around. And that's escaping thought altogether to come down into sensation. And both of those are just infinitely valuable tools if we're lost in thought all the time and if we're suffering in neurosis, et cetera. Yeah.
And I love it because it honors the solving process as not something, to avoid or to repress or anything.
It's a beautiful sense. It's wonderful.
I start thinking about it as a sense. Solving function is already going to be part of my vocabulary because
beautiful. Yay.
No, that's really good. Awesome. Rob, I unfortunately do have to go.
Yeah, of course.
So much to be, cultivated here, and I love this, and I hope that this can give at least a snapshot.
Absolutely.
That are and I hope that people go and check out the stuff that I'll put in the links here, and I look forward to maybe doing this again another time.
I would love it. Yeah.
Those specific concepts, but I love this, and thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for having me, and I'll come back anytime. Thanks.
Alright, gente, obrigada por assistirem. Vou deixar aqui as informações do Rob E sigam a gente, deem like se vocês ainda não seguirem e deram like. Obrigada, gente. Alright, I'll stop recording.